Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to today's program in Sexual Harassment Awareness Week. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me tell those of you who are standing in the back or sitting on the ledge that there are plenty of seats all over. Please come up and make yourself comfortable. This will be about an hour's worth of programming, so sitting down is a good idea. This program is presented by the Sexual Harassment Violence Education Committee at Nassau Community College. And we want you to know that at the college here we have a very strong program against sexual harassment. It's not tolerated on campus. We have a strong policy to prevent it and also to give any victims of sexual harassment a lot of choices about what to do, how to complain about this, but in a way that respects your own desires about how you want to handle it. We have 14 designated counselors on campus, people who've been designated to help victims or people who think they're involved in sexual harassment situation. And we have lots of authority to advocate for you or your friends, should you be that person. I'm one of those counselors. My name is Phyllis Kurland, and I'm in the Student Activities Office. So you can get a list of those people and a copy of the college's sexual harassment policy and lots of literature on the table on the other side of that wall on your way out. And please do pick that up. And if you know someone who's involved in a sexual harassment situation, tell them to come to one of us designated counselors, and we will be very happy to help them. There are also posters hanging around campus that you may have seen saying sexual harassment not tolerated. Those have a list of the designated counselors. Come see us. A lot of people think that if you're in a sexually harassing situation, if you say nothing and you're just quiet, people think it will stop and go away, but it won't stop. It will just get worse. So don't suffer in silence. Come and talk to one of us, and we can do our best to help you figure out what to do. Let me also now tell you about our upcoming programs in this series. This afternoon at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock, we were due to have a speaker who is going to talk about campus sexual assault, what to do about it, and how to heal from being sexual assaulted. Unfortunately, she's ill and can't come, but instead we have a wonderful substitute speaker, Matthew Sandusky. You may know the name Sandusky because Matthew's dad, Jerry Sandusky, was the coach at Penn State University who was accused and convicted of assaulting and molesting children who came to his sports camps. He's now in jail for a very long time. And Matthew is his son, his adopted son, whom he abused for 6 years himself. And Matthew will speak about his experience with this and about how he has created a foundation to help survivors heal from sexual assault. And that's at 1 o'clock and 2:30 today, right in this room. So I hope that you will come back and tell your friends right here today at 1 and 2:30. And then we end next week, Tuesday night, during the evening activity hour, if it doesn't snow, at 7 o'clock with a New York State Trooper, Lisa Lastorino, who's going to talk about how enough is enough and why sexual assault is against the law in New York State and what the law says about it. So I hope that you will come to these programs. If you need a certificate of attendance to prove that you were here for your teacher or for whatever, please pick that up on the way out, as well as picking up, as I said, all this other literature. And now let me introduce to you today's speaker. Professor Richard Newman in the English department came to the college in 1989. He's been teaching English with a specialty in poetry. He's written many books of poetry and published and many readings on campus. I think he also specializes in issues of gender and gender identity and masculinity and femininity, well known. And he's also the secretary of the faculty union and a writer for our annual faculty show. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Richard Newman.
Thank you, Phyllis. And I also want to thank the committee that organizes Sexual Harassment Awareness Week for inviting me to speak. and I want to thank all of you for being here as well. It's not often that men like me, who have survived sexual violence, get to tell our stories in the way that I have been invited to tell you mine. Not just at length, but as part of a program like Sexual Harassment Awareness Week, which has usually been focused almost exclusively on men's sexual aggression against women. There is good reason for that focus, of course. Women and girls are the targets of men's sexual aggression more frequently and more systemically than men and boys are targeted by sexual aggressors of any gender. Nonetheless, as revelations about Kevin Spacey, about the well-known conductor James Levine, and the fashion photographer Bruce Weber have shown, not to mention earlier revelations about, for example, former Speaker of the House of Representatives Dennis Hastert and former Penn State defensive coordinator Jerry Sandusky, and Phil has just told you his adopted son is going to speak here later. Men and boys are also targets of sexual aggression, and we do not deserve to be left out of these conversations just because our numbers are smaller. This is not the first time that I've spoken publicly here at Nassau Community College about the fact that I am a survivor. About 20 years ago, I was teaching an independent study in creative nonfiction with two women of color, each of whom was also a survivor of sexual violence. How we came to work together is a longer story than I have time for here, but what we worked on were personal essays they each wanted to write and publish as a way of breaking the silence in their lives and in their communities about sexual violence against women. In order to get independent study credit, my students had to present their work at an end-of-semester colloquium in front of an audience that would include, among others, the president of the college and the vice president of academic affairs. When the time came to start planning for this presentation, however, my students got really scared. They were concerned they would not be taken seriously. The other students at the colloquium would be presenting conventional research-based projects in traditional academic disciplines. My students, on the other hand, had done little or no research, at least not in the traditional sense. They had no facts other than the facts of their own stories to substantiate what they had to say. And they worried that what they had to say, which dealt sometimes explicitly with the most intimate parts of their lives, would be considered inappropriate and even insulting. They feared they would be seen as nothing more than stereotypical women of color, emotional, traumatized, and not smart enough to cut it at the intellectual level of their more scholarly white peers. To alleviate their concerns as much as possible, I offered to introduce them with a statement about how meaningful it had been for me to work with them, to have been for them the kind of mentor who simply did not exist for me back in the 1980s when I was starting to come to terms with my own experience of sexual violence. This way, I told them, anyone who had a problem with what they said would have to come through me. So that's what we did. I read my introductory statement, and then my students read their essays. Each one, when she was finished, received a standing ovation, and everyone who came to speak with them afterwards, from the president of the college to the families of the other student presenters, was warm and supportive and even thankful, with one exception. A colleague whose student had also presented came over to say he was angry and disappointed. I had, he said, failed in my responsibility as an educator and an academic. First, I treated as serious intellectual work writing that was sensationalizing at best and at worst salacious and titillating. It was none of those. Second, I'd allowed my students to present that writing at the colloquium, lowering the level of discourse at what was supposed to be a celebration of student intellectual achievement to that of a trashy women's magazine. Third, I had inappropriately introduced my own personal experience into the colloquium, turning that portion of the evening into a kind of group therapy session. That's what he said. I don't remember very well what I said in response, but my response isn't really the point right now. I've told you this story because I want you to understand that even though this event is not a scholarly colloquium, even though my talk is perfectly in keeping with the theme of this entire week, once I agreed to give the talk, I also agreed to stand before you in much the same position as my students were back then. You will walk out of this room knowing things about me that even some members of my family don't know, or that, if they do know, they choose to pretend they don't. What this means, whether you realize it or not, some of you may someday appear in my classes, what this means, whether you realize it or not, is that you will walk out of this room knowing things that you could use against me if you chose to. Because no matter how confident and unashamed I may be as I stand here telling you that I was sexually violated as a child, to have been sexually victimized in our culture is still a mark of shame. And we all, if we are honest with ourselves, know how to use that shame, as my colleague tried to do, to silence and dismiss those survivors who choose to speak out. In speaking to you today, in other words, I am choosing to trust you. And I am making this choice knowing full well that some of you might choose to violate that trust. I believe the risk is worth it, however, because being able to say out loud what I'm going to tell you has made the difference for me, as it has made the difference for others who have similar stories to tell, as it could make the difference for some of you here today who have not yet told your own stories. Being able to say out loud what I am going to say to you has made the difference for me between living the life I have wanted to live and feeling like the only life I deserved is the shame-filled half-life that the men who violated me tried to force me into. I never knew the first man's name. When I picture him now, I see a man somewhere between my age, I'm 56, and 10 years younger. I don't think of myself as old, but I think of him as the old man in my building because that's what he looked like to my 12 or 13-year-old eyes. He was white, with dirty blonde hair and a mustache, and he was not quite as tall as I am. In my memory, he walks with a bit of a slouch, his shoulders rounded ever so slightly forward, as if he were always tired. I also remember that he wore glasses and that he had very kind eyes. Shortly after he moved into the apartment at the top of the staircase on the second floor of the building in which my family lived, he said hello to me for the first time. We were standing in the courtyard, and he nodded to me, smiled like he'd known me my whole life, and said, "Hi." The second time, he did the same thing. And by the third or fourth time, a ritual of greeting had grown between us. He would smile and say hello first. I would smile, say the same thing back, and then, for a long, silent moment, he would fix me with his gaze while I stood there, too happily embarrassed to move, wishing when he walked away that I had done something, anything, to prolong the conversation. I was a lonely kid, the oldest of four in a single mother-headed household, and I was desperate for adult male attention and approval. So I was thrilled when one day in late summer the old man did not keep walking after our usual exchange. Instead, he fixed me with his gaze and asked, "When am I going to see you?" I don't remember how I answered him, only that he smiled and went on his way. Sometime after that, I was heading out of our building to meet my friends, and the old man happened to be walking down the staircase leading from his apartment to the front door, which we reached at the same time. As I went to turn the knob, he held the door shut with his left forearm, maneuvering me with his right till I stood facing into the corner near the mailboxes where the door frame met the wall. Covering my body with his own, he ran his hands beneath my shirt and up the legs of my shorts. He groped my chest and belly, squeezed my butt, cupped my crotch, and all the while he kept whispering hoarsely into my ear over and over again, "When am I going to see you?" I had no words for what he was doing, no training such as young children get now in how to scream "no" to attract attention or scare off an attacker. All I could do was stand there till he was finished, and when he was finished, I ran. I don't remember how far or how long or in which direction, but I ran as if I could leave my skin behind, as if running would turn me into another person. When I finally stopped running in the small park across the street from the Lutheran church, I sat a long time with the knowledge that my running had undone nothing, that my body was still the body he'd touched. I had no idea what to do with that knowledge, so I kept it to myself, pretended everything was normal. I even continued saying hello to the old man the same way I always did, forcing myself not to see the ironic twist he added to his smile. A week or so later, I was sitting with some friends in front of my building when the old man came home from food shopping and asked me to help him upstairs with the bags in his shopping cart. I wanted to say no, of course, but I didn't know how without raising for my friends the question of why I was being so rude. The last thing I wanted was to explain myself to them. So I took the bag he pointed to and followed him up to his apartment, where he opened the door and motioned me in ahead of him. I stepped inside, thinking I'd leave the bag by the door and get out as quickly as I could, but he was too fast for me. As soon as the door shut behind him, he pushed the shopping cart to the side, took the bag from my arms and dropped it to the floor. The cans at the bottom landed with a crash that shook the whole apartment. Snaking his arms around my waist, he pushed me further inside, and then he undid my belt and unzipped my pants, pushing them down so they fell around my ankles. All I could do was stand there, frozen to the spot where my feet had stopped moving. Looking down at me with a smile, I have the distinct memory he'd taken out his two front teeth. His eyes, at what I imagine must have been the fear in mine, grew tender. You've never had a blowjob before, have you? Don't you want me to love you? In the silence with which I responded, he gently pulled my underwear down and took my penis in his hands. I remember thinking his fingers were like a cage, and he told me how good it was, how beautiful and big. And then somehow I was sitting on the couch that had been a few steps to my right, and his own pants were down, and his penis, large and purple, hung in front of my face. His voice came from somewhere above me, urging me to play with it, at least to touch it. And the next moments are a blur in my memory, but I can still feel his hands on either side of my head. And I'm sure I don't need to describe to you in detail what comes next. The following day, the old man saw me standing by myself in the courtyard. He stood a short distance away and pleaded with me to go upstairs with him again. This time, he promised, would be different. He would move more slowly, be more gentle. I just stood there, staring off into space, refusing to acknowledge him except for one word, no, which I said very softly, without looking at him. And then I ignored him until he walked away. He left me alone for the rest of the time he lived in my building. Some of you, I imagine, may be wondering why I didn't tell anybody. I sometimes ask myself the same question, or to be more precise, I sometimes wonder how my life would have been different if I had. Then I remember that I did try to tell someone. It did not go well. I was sitting in front of my building with my friend Vanessa when the old man happened to walk by. He nodded in our direction, pausing in front of me for the space of half a breath, but I stared right through him, pretending he wasn't there, and he kept walking. Vanessa, who had responded with her own greeting, turned to me. "Why were you so rude?" she asked. "He was just saying hi." I continued to stare off into space. "Oh, come on, don't pretend you didn't hear me." She grabbed my arm. "What's wrong?" She fixed her eyes on me. I remember how green they were against the light milk chocolate color of her face. She was my friend, and she was concerned. "It's no big deal," I tried to push her question aside. "But he looked right at you. Why did you act like he wasn't even there?" My thoughts were racing and my mind went blank at the same time. I liked Vanessa. I trusted her. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what I could say that would make any sense. Even a statement as simple as, "he touched me," would not have meant back then, in 1974 or 75, what it would mean now. As I sat there, though, a sense of rage began to grow in me, an urge to speak that felt like it wasn't actually a part of me, and I somehow knew I wouldn't be able to stop myself from speaking. So, trying to put as much venom into my voice as I could, trying to give the words that came unbidden the weight of an accusation, the weight of the accusation I wanted them to be, this is what I spit out. He's a faggot. So he's homosexual. So what? Vanessa answered. Why is that a problem? I was crestfallen. In fact, I didn't think being a homosexual was a big deal at all, and I was actually embarrassed by my words. What I felt most, though, was sadness and shame. I couldn't think of anything else to say, and I knew that what I'd said did not come close to communicating what I meant. All I remember is Vanessa and I staring at each other across a silence neither of us knew how to bridge. Male homosexuality, of course, has nothing to do with sexual abuse, and I want to just say that again. Male homosexuality has nothing to do with sexual abuse. In the mid-1970s, however, despite the fact that the American Psychiatric Association had finally decided that homosexuality was not a mental illness, the image of the perverse and depraved homosexual man looking for boys to victimize and recruit was still quite prevalent. More to the point, back then, and I know this may sound strange to you now, it was the only image readily available to me to explain what the old man had done. Today, except for its manifestations on the religious right, we like to think that image has been thoroughly discredited. Yet a version of it does survive in our cultural misunderstanding of how male-perpetrated sexual violence affects boys and men. The websites of both 1 in 6 and Male Survivor, two organizations that support and advocate for men who have been sexually violated, list among the myths that need to be dispelled about us 2 beliefs. One, that something essentially gay in us attracted to us the men who violated us. And the other, that even if we were not gay, the fact of having been sexually violated by a man would make us so. I first encountered the second of these myths in the mid-1980s when I was a first-year graduate student at Syracuse University. I was at the very beginning of telling people about my experience with the old man in the building, and I went to the library looking for books that might help me understand myself better. I found exactly one. I remember sitting on the floor near the shelf where I found the book. I did not want anyone who knew me to walk by and ask what I was reading, and poring over the pages that discussed a study of popular beliefs about boys who had been sexually violated. The results of the survey showed that an awful lot of people thought someone like me would end up gay. This bothered me a lot, not because being gay, had I been gay, would have been a source of shame, but because I understood that being gay in this way of thinking was a mark of disease. And the last thing I wanted was for the people I told about myself to see me in that way. The other thing I remember about that book is how the author compared the belief about boys who'd been violated to an apparently congruent belief about girls who'd been raped. That such girls might very well end up choosing to be lesbians as a result. This apparent congruence, though, the belief that sexual violence would somehow homosexualize the victim, actually masked a deeper incongruence. As the book's author pointed out, to presume that the experience of rape would motivate a girl to become a lesbian would be to assume that the experience was so profoundly repellent that she would actively avoid sex with all other men for the rest of her life. On the other hand, to presume that a boy who'd been sexually violated by a man would become gay would be to assume that the homosexual nature of the experience was so compellingly attractive that the boy, who was of course assumed to be straight, would switch his preference and pursue sex with men. I don't know if the myth about lesbianism still persists. But the fact that people still believe the one about abused boys, or otherwise these two organizations would not have this myth up on their website, does suggest that on some level we see the sexual violation of boys and the sexual violation of girls as two completely different species of violation. A few years after I found that book, I was sitting in a supervisor training session at a summer camp in upstate New York. The focus of the session, which was led by a male psychologist, was how to deal with children who might choose to reveal to us or to one of the counselors we were supervising that they'd been sexually abused. While boys were of course also abused, he explained, it happened so rarely, and the dynamic when dealing with boys was so completely different, he was going to use the word she as the generic pronoun for abused children. If he were to talk to us about boys as well, he said, he'd risk confusing us, and that could lead to our mishandling the situation if a girl did choose to come forward. I have no doubt the psychologist was following the best practices of the time, but his words hit me like a punch in the stomach nonetheless. With a rhetorical wave of the hand, he had made me, along with any other male survivors in the room, not to mention the boys who were being abused who would soon be our campers, vanish. Sadly, and ironically, the Me Too movement has treated men who've been sexually victimized in much the same way. Like that psychologist, the men and women writing and advocating in support of Me Too acknowledge that men are also victimized. Like that psychologist, they point out, just as I did at the beginning of this talk, that women are victimized far more frequently and systemically than men are. And then, just like that psychologist, they make male survivors disappear from the conversation, focusing their attention exclusively when they talk about men on men who are perpetrators, or enablers, or bystanders, or sometimes allies. The possibility that those of us who are survivors might have something useful to add to the conversation isn't explored at all. I need here to step back for a moment and acknowledge explicitly something that has been implicit in everything I've said so far. We would not be here in this room. There would not be a program called Sexual Harassment Awareness Week. There would not even be a concept of sexual harassment were it not for feminism and the women's movement. It was their work in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that gave us no choice as a society but to confront and at least to start dealing with sexual violence against women. No one back then, and I mean no one, was talking in any public way about sexual violence against men and boys. Except that I generally supported the goal of women's equality, I personally didn't pay much attention to feminism until I turned 19, which is in 1981, about 6 years before the episode with the psychologist that I just told you about. 1981 also happens to be the year when sexual harassment first became a violation of the law. That summer, because a college friend had given it to me, I brought with me to my first summer camp job a copy of Adrienne Rich's book of essays on lies, secrets, and silence. I remember sitting in my bunk during an afternoon break and reading this passage in the essay, Caryatid, 2 columns. So these are Rich's words. Taught to view our bodies as our totality, our genitals as our chief source of fascination and value, many women have become dissociated from their own bodies, viewing themselves as objects to be possessed by men rather than as subjects of an existence. As soon as I read those words, a small voice in my head began to speak, and I mean that literally. I heard an actual voice. But what about me, it asked. What about what happened to me? I tried at first to pretend that I hadn't heard it, that I hadn't read the words to which it responded. But I could not stand the way lying to myself made me sick to my stomach, so I stopped trying to deny what had just happened. And after a moment of pure revulsion, as the image flashed through my mind of what the old man did to me in the lobby of my building, a different feeling, a kind of relief and liberation began to spread through me. For the first time, I had a language with which to name accurately what the old man had done. And to the extent that whatever healing I have achieved is built on that initial naming, I owe that healing to feminism. It was through feminism that I first learned the only person responsible for a sexual violation, the only person to blame, is the person who committed it. And it was through feminism that I came to understand how important it is for survivors to tell our stories, so that other survivors will know they are not alone, so that the collective power of our stories will strip away the shame and silence and deceit that the perpetrators of sexual violence rely on as a kind of protective shield. Feminism taught me to see sexual violence as systemic, as the logical result of a culture that treats women as objects. But right there, I ran up against a very uncomfortable truth. As much as I wanted it to be, as much as I had learned and gained strength from pretending it was, as much as my experience with the old man in my building seemed to make it so, the feminism I had discovered, was not really about me. Or, more accurately, to the extent that it was about me as a man no differently than it was about the men who were the perpetrators or enablers of the sexual violence feminists were fighting to end. What made this truth so difficult to accept, so uncomfortable, was that it was really true. No matter how much I wanted to believe otherwise, feminism showed me, by teaching me to look at my own ideas and behavior from a woman's point of view, that I possessed all the power and privilege that comes with being a man in our society. That I know how to take advantage of that power and privilege, how to assume it as my right. I may choose to the best of my ability not to behave in those ways, and I may think it would be better if men didn't have this power and privilege, but that doesn't change the fact that I have it, and that people treat me as if I have it, whether I want them to or not. As a survivor, though, and this is something the feminism of the 1980s didn't recognize at all, despite that power and privilege, I am fundamentally different from 5 out of every 6 men. Think about that number for a minute. As anyone who makes even the most cursory of forays into the academic literature on the frequency of sexual violence against men will tell you, there is a dizzying array of often changing and sometimes competing statistical findings and claims. The one number that has been remarkably stable, at least based on everything I have been able to find, is the one that says 1 in 6 men will have experienced some form of unwanted coercive sexual contact before the age of 17. So stable is that number, in fact, that the nonprofit I mentioned earlier, 1 in 6, takes its name from it. That number means that I am almost certainly not the only male survivor in this room, and that I have likely shared every classroom in which I have taught for the past 3 decades with fellow survivors as my students. It means there are likely to be at least 1 or 2 male survivors in each classroom you sit in on this campus, and that a not insignificant number of male faculty, staff, and administrators are also survivors. Add to those men 1 in 6 of all the men living in Garden City, in Nassau and Suffolk counties, in New York City, in New York State. Perhaps you can see where I'm going with this. Just the number of survivors living in New York State alone seems to me large enough to suggest there's something as systemic about sexual violence against boys as there is about sexual violence against women. We just don't know yet what it is. Now take that 1 in 6 statistic and apply it to Congress, to our elected officials across this country, to our judges, our prosecutors, police officers, budget directors, all the people, overwhelmingly men, who pass and enforce the laws, establish the policies, set the priorities which shape our individual and collective civic lives. If 1 in 6 of those men was sexually abused as a child, it would be naive to assume this experience does not somehow shape the way they do their job. Even if we can't see the systemic roots of sexual violence against boys, in other words, it's not hard to see how that violence might still have a systemic impact on our society. Talking about sexual violence against men in these terms, however, has not been a priority. We are much more comfortable talking about men as perpetrators, enablers, or bystanders, roles that are congruent with traditional notions of manhood and masculinity, and that therefore deny the sexual vulnerability that is such a large part of what it means to be a survivor. Indeed, we have a hard time seeing sexually vulnerable men as men in the first place. Some years ago, while discussing consent in what happened to be an all-female women's studies class, my students started complaining about how tired they were, as one of them put it, of all the fucking clueless ways that men keep hitting on us. At the top of their list was the way so many men seem to think that even the slightest expression of interest on a woman's part was an invitation to some kind of physical interaction. From touching and hugging, to holding hands, to kissing, to grinding on the dance floor, to more. This was, they all agreed, a tremendous turnoff, and one of the things they found least attractive about men. So I asked my students how they would feel if a man they were interested in asked permission first, to hug them, for example, or to dance up close, or to kiss them. No way, they all laughed. That guy would end up being the needy, clingy type, the kind of guy, that same woman said, who'd get all weepy and shit. And who wants a man like that? What they wanted, they explained, what they desired, was a man who knew what he wanted, who was confident enough to take it without asking, but who knew how to do that in a sexy and sophisticated way. That sophistication, they explained with a "duh, I can't believe I have to tell you this" tone in their voice, was part of what made it getting hit on, when it was done right, so hot. So then I asked my students to imagine a situation in which they weren't sure whether a man they wanted to kiss was interested in being kissed. Would they consider asking his permission before doing so? They laughed at this question even more loudly than the previous one. They simply could not imagine why they would have to. What man doesn't want it? Again, that same student. What real man, if you put it ready to eat on his plate, is going to say, "No thanks, I'm not hungry"? What if he did, though, I asked? What if he did say, "I'm not hungry"? Then what the hell good is he? Came the response, and the rest of the class laughed. My students and I had this conversation about 2/3 of the way through the semester. By then, we had covered issues like reproductive rights, women's health care, women in education, and the politics of housework and childcare. When it came to those issues, my students had been pretty much unanimous. In pursuit of gender equality, it was incumbent upon men to change. Regarding sexual consent, however, there was clearly a line of change they did not want men to cross. Despite their complaints about all the stupid ways men hit on them, in other words, what my students wanted was not a fundamental change in how men tried to pick them up. What they wanted was for men to become better at what they were already doing. To put this another way, by rejecting as sexually undesirable a man who would ask permission to kiss them, by refusing to imagine as a real man, a man who might himself want to be asked, these women were not simply insisting that men should behave like men, they were also asserting and defending the boundaries of their own heterosexuality, staking out, as it were, the limits of their own desires. Whether they understood it this way or not, in other words, my questions had threatened them, and the ridicule they reflexively heaped on the men I'd asked them to imagine suggested just how deep that threat went. I'd like to suggest that a similar kind of heteronormative reflex, though not so obviously sexualized, lies at the heart of why we find it so difficult to make room for male survivors in our conversations about sexual violence. Why, when we talk about those men, we tend to do so only in the most superficial ways, and why, when we talk about the violence itself, we tend to treat it not as its own phenomenon, but as an extension of men's sexual violence against women. Consider, for example, what I said earlier about how Me Too conversations will mention men as victims, but then focus their attention almost solely on combating men's sexual aggression against women. The implicit assumption seems to be that this focusing on ending the victimization of women will, as a matter of course, make things better for men as well. Just to be clear, I do believe that's true, and I don't mean anything I say next to imply otherwise. I also believe it is true, however, that to respond to sexual violence against men by looking through the lens of sexual violence against women is at best to misconstrue and at worst to render invisible the actual experience of men who've been violated. It's the inverse of a phenomenon that feminists have long criticized in fields ranging from healthcare to literary criticism. The idea that the male body and/or male perspective is the norm, and the assumption that this norm automatically applies with equal validity to women as well. You can see what I'm talking about far more clearly in an article called Sexual Violence Against Men and Women in War, A Masculinities Approach, which was published in the Nevada Law Journal in 2014 by a scholar named Valerie K. Vojdik. When men are raped, she writes, they symbolically lose their gender identity as men, who are socially constructed to dominate, and they are feminized and socially constructed as the female victim. The rape of men thus turns the male into a powerless victim, a symbolic woman who is sexually violated by the perpetrator through rape. To be fair, Vojdik's agenda is in part to explain why international law should recognize the rape of men as rape, which it did not do at the time of her writing, and as far as I know, still does not do now. It makes strategic sense, therefore, that Vojdik would base her argument on an analogy to the rape of women, which has been a violation of international law since the 1990s. Vojdik, however, doesn't treat this line of reasoning as a necessary strategy. Rather, as she says in her conclusion, the analogy is central to achieving her goal, which is to make sexual violence against men more visible as a way of deepening our understanding of the construction of certain male bodies as masculine and dominant, both in war and in peace. Or, just to make this concrete and personal, to deepen our understanding of how forcing his penis into my barely pubescent mouth helped the old man in my building construct for himself a masculine and dominant identity. Vojdik is no doubt right that one purpose of raping men in war is to feminize them and subordinate them, to rob them of the sense of manhood and masculinity out of which their resistance might emerge, and thus to magnify and cement in place the dominance of whichever side is doing the raping. To apply that same logic to what the old man in my building did to me, however, seems counterintuitive at best. As a 12 or 13-year-old boy, I was already subordinate. What possible threat could I have posed to his sense of masculinity and dominance? Moreover, how would you apply Vojdik's logic when the perpetrator is a woman, a middle school teacher, for example, and the boy she violates is one of her students? An occurrence, by the way, especially if the boy is a little older, which many people still see as a positive and healthy contribution to the manhood and masculinity the boy is supposed to develop. Vojdik's logic here reverses what I have always understood to be axiomatic in how we should approach sexual violence. That both your analysis and your response should be rooted in the experience of the victim, not the perpetrator's agenda. Rather, in other words, than start by asking what rape does to men as rape, Vojdik starts by asking what the people who commit that rape want to accomplish. As a result, instead of trying to understand male sexual vulnerability on its own terms, Vojdik treats it as derivative of the sexual vulnerability traditionally assigned to women. Or to put it another way, because she focuses on what the perpetrators want to accomplish, she tacitly accepts their definition of manhood and masculinity, which, like the one so enthusiastically endorsed by my women's studies students, excludes from sexual vulnerability what it means to be a, quote, excludes sexual vulnerability from what it means to be a, quote, real man, unquote. Ironically, this exclusion is also what drives the myth that sexual violation will make a boy or man gay, since within that same version of masculinity, gay men cannot be real men. The congruence between this hate-filled homophobic myth and Wojcik's explicitly feminist argument, perspectives we would normally think of as diametrically opposed to each other, results, I would like to suggest, from the heteronormative reflex I described earlier. Feminism, in other words, may have given us a language with which to name sexual violence against men as sexual violence, but we still don't have a language for male sexual vulnerability that does not depend on an analogy to something men are not, women. This failure to talk about male sexual vulnerability on its own terms is one largely unexamined reason why our public conversations about sexual violence and/or sexual consent focus almost exclusively on protecting and respecting the sexual boundaries of women. The idea that men, gay, straight, bi, trans, might have sexual boundaries of our own, the question of how we might define those boundaries, of how they might feel like of what they might feel like to us, how we might express them in relationships, in the process of flirting, or when dealing with colleagues in the classroom or the workplace, how those boundaries might connect to our potential for helping to conceive a child, or how we might teach boys about these boundaries from the start. At least in my experience, none of this gets explored in the conversations we have, except in the most nominal of ways. To put this a little differently, since to describe what these boundaries might look like and how they might work would probably require a whole other talk, one way of thinking about the heteronormative reflex I described above is as a kind of blindness. Take me, for instance. To look at me now, 6'1", 240 pounds, I'm guessing it's difficult to see the skinny and terrified 12-year-old boy absolutely powerless to stop the old man in my building from forcing his penis into my mouth. And I'm guessing it may be even more difficult to imagine the shy, awkward, insecure, and desperately needy boy who just a couple of years later, when I was 15, and then for 2 or so years after that, could not stop another man from using my body as his plaything. A story I have not told you for the sake of time. One reason I imagine it's hard to see those boys in me is that it's hard to see the body I live in now as vulnerable in the same way my body was back then. The truth is, though, all it takes is someone strong and powerful enough, and there is always someone who is strong enough and powerful enough, and they could do to me whatever they wanted. I live every day with that knowledge. And it has shaped in ways both large and small, conscious and unconscious, long and short term, many of the choices, sexual and otherwise, I have made in my life. Some of you in this room know exactly what I'm talking about, and in concluding, I'd like to speak directly to you, not only, but particularly to the men. We call ourselves survivors. A way of thinking about our experience that we also owe to the feminism of the 1980s. And we use that term to mean that if someone sexually violated you and you are here, then you are not merely a victim. To be a survivor is to be someone who acted, who did something. Whatever it was you had to do, even choosing to endure passively what the person who violated you did to you so that you could walk away in possession of your life. I cannot say this strongly enough. If you walked away alive, you are in possession of your life. And if you are alive, there is hope. Because the choice you made for your life means you have the strength to continue to make that choice for the rest of your life. And that, I think, is where I will end. Thank you so much for being here and for your I think there's a microphone somewhere for questions. If anybody. Or comments?
I first want to thank you for all the conscious paper and forthrightness. I think it's really, really important. And we have been acquaintances, colleagues. I never knew this then.
Right.
And I applaud that that you know it now. And,
Can you hear her in the back?
A little bit.
Maybe we can bring the microphone so that...
That's all right. I'll stand up, and I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the conversation that we've had. We've known each other kind of at a distance, thank you. For many years, I never knew this about you, and I think it was really courageous and very positive that you shared this with all of us. As an educator in human sexuality, I feel really strongly about having this voiced, and even within my classes at 19 and 20 years of age, a lot of people are not comfortable using the language of the genitals, penis, vagina, vulva, and I think that my question to you is, do you think if there was more parent-child sexual communication, more sexuality education at younger ages, that maybe you would not have had to go through what you did for so long, because you would have had the power to say no, and this is my body, no.
Right.
No.
I mean, well, yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yes, right? I mean, one of the difficulties back, so we're going back, I was 12, so that's 40-something years ago, right? One of the difficulties was there was no way to talk about it.
Right.
And if you can't talk about it, and you can't name it, you can't understand it. And if you can't understand it, then you end up, if you are somebody who has been, sexually assaulted or violated, you know the discomfort in your own body. But if you can't name it, you can't really do anything about it. So I think, on one, absolutely that would be true. But it's also true, right, that even if I had the language, and I think this is the other side of what you're saying, I mean, the second guy, the guy that I didn't tell the story, he was the maitre d' at a catering hall where I worked at. And he would feel me up all the time, and I'm not going to go into the details. But I could not have stopped him. Saying no to him would not have mattered. But having the language would have changed the experience afterwards. It would have made healing more accessible more easily, and I think that's also an important thing, right? That's also important because sometimes you can't stop it. But at least if you have the language, then you have the healing is accessible afterwards.
And I think one other point that you made that I had never thought of, and I agree with you 100%, is that the Me Too movement has really been sexist relative to only looking at the side of women. And I think that, men are victims and need to move to survivorship the same way that women do. And there's so much of it, and we don't acknowledge that.
That's true. And that's a hard thing. Because that means changing, like, a whole cultural, that's hard, but yeah, you're right.
Anybody else have a question that wants the mic?
Why don't you come up and take the mic after he does? Because I saw someone back there raise their hand.
I just wanted to ask, do you find forgiving like healing? Like, I don't know if that's my place to ask, but
Do I find forgiving healing?
like forgiving the sick dude, like.
You mean actually forgiving the person who did this to me?
Yeah, is that like a healing?
For me personally, it's irrelevant. Because I think forgiveness is something that you earn, right? I really believe that. So for example, the second guy, the first guy, he disappeared, I never saw him again. The second guy, he was actually kind of a marginal friend of the family, right? If somehow he and I had remained in touch, and if he had earned forgiveness, sure, I might forgive him. But I also think it's really, really important. Forgiveness is not necessary to heal. You don't have to forgive the person who did this to you in order to heal, right? Part of what healing is saying, you know what, I'm not going to let this person have power over me. And he did or she did whatever it is that they did, but I'm going to deal with myself. And if you link healing, if you link forgiveness to healing, which some, and I mean, I'm not trying to say anything about Christianity, but I have read articles where there are some Christian denominations where women who have been raped, they have been told you must forgive, right? That you must forgive as part of healing. I think when you link healing to forgiveness, you perpetuate the power that the person who did it has. Right? Because then you can't heal unless you forgive them. And if they have done nothing to earn forgiveness, and I don't want to suggest, I don't think that violators can never earn forgiveness. I would never say that, right? But if they have done nothing to earn forgiveness, and you forgive them anyway, then there's no justice, right? Does that kind of answer your question? Do you want to ask?
I don't really have a question, but it's more like a comment. I just want to thank you for sharing your story, and that's very brave. And also, I love my teacher. She's very like open and passionate about human sexuality.
Well, tell her that.
Yes. And I just think, you know, like right now, like everything going on with the Hollywood scandal is really open, and there's the saying like think globally, act locally. So like even if this happened to you, there's a bunch of resources, like you shouldn't be ashamed. I have a bunch of friends who have told me their stories, and it's never happened to me, but like they vent to me and I just don't know what to do because they don't want me to share their story. But
sometimes all you need to do is listen.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if you're you're a friend, you can just be a friend.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you can give information, right? I mean, Phyllis, for example, if there's students here, Phyllis listed the counselors. You know, you can share information. There's the Nassau County Sexual Assault Hotline.
Safe Center, they were yesterday for sexual awareness, what we're wearing project.
Right.
And my classes, we have their phone number, it's right here.
Right. So you
No
can.
charge, no charge.
So you can, but I mean, sometimes as a friend, all you need, your job should be to be a friend. You can't be a therapist.
Yes.
And you know, I don't know that you should try. And I think when you listen to someone and you believe them, you may not know just how strengthening that is for them. To know that there is somebody who believes me that I can trust.
Right. Thank you. And I just want to say the time for change is now.
I agree. Any other? I guess sometimes it's hard to know what to say. Sometimes it's hard to know what to say after. So I will let me ask. Can I ask you a question, and maybe someone will answer? I'm just curious. Did what I said make you think about anything? About your own? And would anybody be willing to say what it made them think?
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Do you go to the mic?
It made me think about the scandal of the Catholic Church. I'm a Catholic. And certainly, I would think that most of those victims were males.
I believe statistically that's true, but I don't.
Yeah, and I think that you speaking about it sheds light on the vulnerability of children, especially when there's someone who is in power. So thank you very much for that. But that's what it made me think about
thank you.
immediately.
Thank you. I saw you nodding your head.
I did.
No. Well then, I guess it's almost time, right? Yeah. Well then, thank you also very much for coming.
Stay here. Very good. Yes, yeah, that's sweet. That one. Awesome. Awesome. Extra credit. All right. Very good. You can go. I'll see
What happens? Things get like, you know, I should have said But yeah, no, but absolutely. Then, and you know, and if I can, I'm happy to come and talk to class. You know, I'm happy. No, oh, okay. I should tell someone also. Because I should tell them. Yeah. Thank
Once you come down the street and across the street, it's obvious. That's right. And so first weekend, I go, God bless you. And
you are my ship.
well, that was very good. Every single week, so I have of course, trees are red. People do that. I don't have anything. But, you know, I mean,
Right. And that's
unless it's a pool that goes in and answers the and they have a fence, so that's where you look at that fence. That's close to the property, I mean, close to the street. They actually, the teacher was public, the teacher was some teachers, that's my teacher, my friends. So, I mean, I was there, but I can't well, he got his pension, and he
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
she talked to what she got when she was coming over. She was everybody.
Rona? Before I was sorry. Oh my God. Your students want to, your class with you. I mean, I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy if you work together about it. You know, if it makes sense. Sometimes it I'm happy to do that. I just want to. Thank you, Dolores. I'm glad you came. Thank you.
I go to my library, I know the library, I always read.
I'm sorry. I just got your
We're gonna get all the traffic leaving. And you're younger than I am.
You are. I've seen you, and I realize I don't know your name. Dolores, it's nice to meet you.
I mean, I was with the we would take the bus and we would go to the beach and get there and the sun. And it's actually a bit long. Wow. I wouldn't have thought.
The thing.
No, we did. I don't know that I was the one that did it, but one We didn't even know what it meant. I couldn't believe my mother even said that. She must have thought we knew more than me. Yeah, it's right now.
I was really surprised. I have to say, I mean, that I did not expect to stand here.
Oh, yeah.
I just did. Not that
Not when I
I
was
considered it,
12.
but I just did not expect to stand here.
But 13, when I was in, well, I was a child, and I lost weight. I mean,
Well,
when I went in the city, when I was in college and after,
an experience like
you know,
that.
and you it's kind of weird, but again, that was back
And I
how
know,
old I
because I mean, I've had
am.
the
You know, it
experience
wasn't
enough
like I
to
liked
know
it, but like, well, I
I
must be
don't,
attracted.
my presentation
But
was such
you
that
didn't
people
take it as an
imagine.
insult, as sexual harassment.
Right, because
You
I'm a
know,
big guy, I'm
they
6'1",
like
and I
there.
got a voice, I got presence. and-
But
Yes.
it does have these things that happen like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look at you and you can tell me some story about something that happened.
That's the only one she was there.
And I would look at you and say,
My mother was very nice.
please tell me that.
Right,
You
My
your
mother and I was in
presentation
New York Park
does not
twice,
do
so she said,
that.
oh,
Yeah.
we loved you, we wanted you so much. I go, Ma, nobody
But
wants two
students,
kids
they have
in a year. I don't need you. I know you love me. I was not a plan B because she was breastfeeding. She was breastfed, you didn't get pregnant. She wanted you to feel good though. Well, dude, she didn't have to. I know they love you. That's how it was. Don't tell me I was playing. My brother was playing. I was not playing. Yeah. Yeah, well, she wouldn't have wanted two kids.
I'm happy that
What was like as you were looking out, I mean, obviously something like that.
people were.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
When we got into the bit about feminism, we lost some. But that's what I kind of figured. I tried to sort of weave the
Right.
stuff in and out of the narrative. But that one section.
Very efficient. You remember?
I could see it.
Yeah.
Well, they came back, when
Yeah.
the energy and the party came back, you know, around when you started because obviously she can't.
Nobody was saying
Yeah.
anything else.
Oh, I know, I heard a couple of stories.
So they were paying attention to that.
Yeah, no, I heard a couple, I heard people in general pay attention to them. It's hard to say.
Well, he came up in my office once. I remember his wife worked in my office. Okay? And I was chair, so I only became chair in 1993. So we're not talking ancient history. You check, what is that, rate my professor, and I go, never look at it. He goes, hunting.
Oh, yeah, of course. And I'm,
They think I'm
I'm
not.
glad,
One
honestly.
woman, she
I'm
wanted to
glad
have
that
my
no one
children.
spoke
Isn't
up
that
and sort of
wonderful? And he did
showed
that.
me.
Oh, yeah, it's all
The
they
best
do.
thing,
Started to
the
tell me.
best thing,
That
that
was-
was, and I'm like,
That would, because, and I actually thought about this, I wanted to this when I got here. Because I told the story so explicitly,
that he sexually harassed us.
whether or not it
Old
would make
college
sense to
days.
say.
He said you have to leave for a year, get psychological, I mean, maybe it wasn't, the name wasn't Steve.
Well, we didn't have anybody to have like a.
And you have to, you have to, if you're gone for a year, you won't get paid, you have to go
But
to
I don't think we
psychological
needed to,
counseling.
because number one, there are
Counselor says
some
it's
classes
okay,
where,
and you
I
came
have
back.
to
And
tell
I
you,
met him.
I don't know if
This
that
is-
was
this
very
is
small.
like- Not years ago, this wasn't even said.
I was sitting there
This
with an
was-
process and got back and walked around, and came back and looked
President
at
of our union, I mean, he was kind of sleazy.
He's in my community. And, he was openly, it's still current. He's told stories in the past about he was boyfriend. So, you know, what it's worth, the literature was out.
Yeah, no, I know. But my point being simply that I was, it did not occur to me until today that telling the story so explicitly.
Well, the pendulum swung almost.
That's all I mean.
To the wrong way. It's okay, I can,
But look, I have asked a question about forgiveness.
but if you do
The
that,
city
I
came
can
going like this.
create all kinds of problems.
If a man came up to me and said, can I hug you? I would say, okay, you know, if I want to be, I would see that that's not a man. A man, that's a nice thing to say to somebody.
Yeah, but that's you,
Just
your,
hugging me.
that was you,
And obviously, I'll
time
talk
you
to
grew
my
up,
class
which is
about my
different
friends.
than then.
If they have questions, I told everybody else, that if they have questions that they really feel compelled to ask them.
Should they get quiet?
Either they can come to the office or they can email me.
Yeah, I mean, they're just articulating and thinking together. Hi, how are you?
Good. This is from level one, right?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.